So learning how to use margins is a really critical part of becoming a mangaka, especially if you want to work with a publisher or get to work printed. And even if you work digitally, I think it's really important that you need to know this information because you will need to use it someday. Now, before I go into the actual lines themselves, I do want to drop just a little bit of a disclaimer. I'm going to be mostly using the ICB4 margins as examples for the rest of this video, but I'm also going to be using the margins that I used when I was setting up my print for Comics Wellspring. And there are a lot of different variations in the margins that you can use for both Western comics and manga. Western comics and manga tend to have slight variations in these margins, but for the most part have all of the same lines, albeit with different names. And each paper type, each publisher, each individual manga magazine even can have their own set of margins. And so not every single set of margins that you look at will look exactly the same. However, they all do tend to have the same lines, just arranged differently. So thank you for listening to the intro, and let's get into it. Hi guys, and welcome back to my Diary of a Mangaka. Happy Manga Monday. I figured for this particular edition, I would sort of reflect on one of the bits of feedback that I gave probably the most when I was a mentor for the Learn to Draw Manga channel and their sort of like manga education program. And one of like the most common bits of feedback that I had to give was about the incorrect use of margins. I figured this could be a really fun video to make to sort of help people with this and kind of go back into making tutorials, so sit down and buckle up. So Blueline paper like this ICB4 paper is pretty common, and it uses a very special type of blue that goes by a few different names, and it is used in both Western comic and manga papers as well as a variety of other paper types, and it's called non-photo blue or non-repro blue. This specific shade of blue is very special because when inkers would scan their pages and clean them up digitally, it's very easy to make these blue lines vanish during the editing process. And you can actually use a specific set of scan settings to make them vanish during like the actual scan itself, thus the name of the blue. It's also pretty common to see, like, especially Western comic artists, and I'm seeing more and more mangaka do this as well. They'll actually use like non-photo blue pencils or non-photo blue pencil leads, which I also use. They do work, I promise, so that you can do the sketch on the like actual paper itself, and then when you scan, you can ink on top of it, but the blue itself will be easily removable from the scan itself. And so if you're the type of person that really wants to do your sketch and ink on the same paper and not have to use like a light box to transfer them over, I would definitely recommend you start using the non-photo blue pencils for your sketches. Alright, so now getting to the actual paper itself. Within this paper, we have a couple different types of lines here. We have the inner border, which is what Clip Studio calls it, but it's also called the live area or the safe area. And then we have our trim, we have our bleed, and then lastly, we have a special margin that doesn't really appear in every type of comic or manga paper, and it's far less common, or maybe even almost non-existent when it comes to Western comics. The IC paper here that I'm using as an example doesn't have this particular line, at least that I've seen, but we'll cover this later as I use it for my own work. But what do all of these lines actually mean? The inner line here is referred to as the inner border in Clip Studio, but as I mentioned earlier, it's also called the live area or the safe area, and then in manga it's called the Hanmen. When you're making manga, you'll use this line as the edge for the majority of your panels. Some mangaka actually really rarely go outside of this line, especially when they're making yonkoma, but it really depends on the specific mangaka and their own individual unique preferences. If you'd like your artwork to go beyond this Hanmen area, there's a different line that you're going to need to know about, which I'll cover a little bit later, and that's called the bleed. But in general for the Hanmen, things like the text inside the dialogue bubbles and faces and hands and anything that you don't want to risk getting cut off, you're going to want to keep inside this line if at all possible. Alright, and then this sort of like middle line that we have here is most often referred to as the trim, but in manga you might hear it referred to as the tachikiri sen, or the to be trimmed line. Manga panels can extend beyond this line, as I sort of just mentioned in the point before, and if they do, those panels are called tachikiri, which is, to be trimmed. This line is probably the trim itself is the most important line when it comes to making comics and manga. Both of them utilize this line. And when you crop the page as part of exporting it, or it's being cut during the printing and binding process, this is where that cut or crop, if you're working digitally, is going to happen. And so it's really, really important that you never, ever, let me say it, never, ever put the edge of a panel on this line for the reasons I'm about to get into. This outermost line is called the bleed, and I mentioned it in my first point, but it's always safe to assume that everything in this little bleed section, which is like between the trim line and between the bleed lines themselves, are going to get cut off. Now, why would we want to put art here if it's just going to get cut off later? Well, if you want your artwork to go all the way to the edge of the page, you need to take your art into the bleed and preferably past it. Why? Sometimes crops don't happen perfectly, or printers just won't make accurate cuts. And so having your artwork go all the way past the trim through the bleed ensures that no matter where that cut or crop actually happens, your artwork will actually go all the way to the end of the page. Otherwise, you have like the risk of this little white sliver like going along the edges of your pages, and that is definitely not awkward. And then we have another special little line called the safety margin. And I don't have this particular line on this guide, so I'm actually going to move over to a different document. And then we'll also use this document to go over all of the other terminology that I've not covered yet. The safety margin is really only used when your work is going to be printed in two different formats. And this allows the mangaka to sort of keep two different sets of margins in mind as they make their manga. Such as the magazine format and the tankobon format when they're making their pages. Like, imagine how much it would suck after spending all of that time making your pages that you now, like, you've been printed in the magazine and now it's time for the tankobon. Imagine if you would have to edit all of your pages all over again because now you have a different set of margins to use. That would suck a lot. And so by having the safety margin in mind when you're making your pages, you can actually plan for and accommodate how your work is going to look. That way, no matter which one it's being printed in, your artwork's going to look fine. That's basically the point of a safety margin. And in the spirit of margins, the lines aren't the only things that have names. And both comics and manga have names for these sections, but to keep it as brief as possible, I don't want this video to go too long, I'm going to only include the names from manga. Sorry, Western comics folks. This is a manga channel after all. So manga paper in general with the blue lines is called Genko Yoshi, and brands like IC and Deleter are pretty standard when it comes to making manga. There are also Western comic brands that make this type of paper. When I was making manga, I preferred to use the Deleter paper, but I know the IC is pretty common as well. And so taking it from the top, the 10 is the top section of our manga paper. If you know the kanji for this one, and you know what 10 means, this one's pretty easy to remember. It's like sky or heaven, depending on the context. And on the opposites, maybe predictably, the bottom of our paper is called the chi, which is basically like earth or like the ground. And then we have two sections on the outer edges of our paper. One of them is called the hashira, or pillar, and this sits right inside the margins. And then on the outside of those margins, we have the koguchi, which is more or less like the edge. You can basically think of this as sort of like where your readers are going to enter and exit your pages from, with the pillars sort of like being the guide that holds everything up in the middle, which I think is kind of a cool way to think about it. And then now, this innermost area I've kind of already covered, and it's called the Hanmen. It's sort of like, the area where you have like most of your text, your dialogues, your faces. Most of your panel borders are going to end here. Panels, for the record, are called koma. If you wanted to know what that was, it's called koma. Frames, basically. But the thing I really want to talk about in relation to the Hanmen is this area in between, right? When you look at a 2-page spread, this area here that I've highlighted in gray is a very special section. And this is this section is one of the many reasons why I would always tell my students, and I am hardcore to like believe this to this day, that when you're preparing your name or your storyboard, you should always prepare it in 2-page spreads. But this area is called the nodo, and anything inside this area is most likely going to be very, very hard to see. In fact, if you take a bunch of manga and you look at the top or the bottom of them, you're going to see like a blank part of the spine where there isn't any artwork. That is the nodo section of your pages. And the easy way to remember this, and I think the Silent Manga Audition blog for this is how I remember it, is to call the nodo the no-do section of your page, right? And you don't want to put anything in there unless you absolutely have to. And even then, when you make a 2-page spread, there's a very specific way you have to align your pages when you're doing a 2-page spread, which I will cover in a completely separate video because it is a process. But yeah. And so all of that kind of concludes the different sections of a manga page, both as a single individual page and as a 2-page spread. With all of this, there's always going to be sort of like different variations, maybe what people call the names based on like who you're working with. Some people may just use the Western names, some editors might use like the Japanese names. When I'm working with Hisashi-san, sometimes it's just really helpful for me just to use the Japanese name. That way, like if we're talking about, I'm getting feedback or he's trying to tell me like put this here, I'll be like, oh, do you mean this? And I'll use the Japanese name. He's like, oh yeah. Or he'll be like, no, I mean this. And I'm like, oh, okay, I got you. So having access to the knowledge of all of these words and what they mean, it might feel a little otaku-ish, and I do mean that in the way that otaku usually is meant, and that's not a nice way. So like sometimes being a weeb and an otaku and having knowledge of these words can feel a little weird. But I think it's really helpful to have the knowledge of this. That way, if maybe you're going to go work with a Japanese editor, or that's a goal that you have, having that knowledge in advance before you get there is going to help you a lot. In fact, like when I was working with Hisashi-san and then talking with Tabuchi-san for the Kodansha review, it was really helpful to ask questions using those words, and he was crazy impressed that I even knew what those words were, let alone understood what they meant. So yeah, I hope you found this helpful. I know sometimes these lines can be a little intimidating sometimes, but I hope this will help them maybe feel a little bit less intimidating. If you have any questions or concerns, or maybe you're stuck on something, please just leave a comment below. Also, if there's something specific that you would like me to cover in a future video, just leave a comment below. I've been collecting all of the comments so far that I've been getting on previous videos, and so yeah, I'd love to see what you guys would like me to cover. I would also really love to thank my patrons on Patreon. I really appreciate all of your guys' support, and if you would like to join, you can check out the link in the description below to support me. It's only $3 a month, and you get access to exclusive artwork and work in progress stuff, and you get to see everything ahead of time. You can absolutely join if you'd like to support the channel, but don't worry, it's optional. I understand money's tight in this economy. If you liked this video and don't want to miss any future ones, go ahead and hit the subscribe button, and if you want to get notifications so that you don't miss my videos, make sure you hit the bell icon, and then you'll get all of your notifications. My name is Artcrumbs. This has been Diary of a Mangaka, and I will see you next week. Ciao!